And now we will get to and then head to our presentation. I know I myself, as a fellow wildfire practitioner, am really excited to see what we have to offer today. We have Eric Dickhock, who is the Planning and Community Development Manager at the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. He works extensively on wildfire, climate change, and a whole host of other issues pertaining to land use and community development at the statewide level in California. And we also have Tennis Wick, who has been the Director of Permits Sonoma since 2013. And he also works extensively on land use and development and wildfire planning in Sonoma County, and also staffs the planning and intelligence section of the Sonoma County Emergency Operations Center. So brings that perspective to today as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Eric.
Great, thanks Miles and Justine, and thanks to the whole CALE team and ASAP for hosting these learning networks in these sessions and inviting me and Tennis to the table today. I will go ahead and share my screen and get my presentation started. So bear with me. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. And going into presentation mode here. Okay. So again, my name is Eric Dickhock. I'm with the Governor's Office of Planning Research here in the state of California. I'm the program manager for the Planning and Community Development team. We also have a climate resilience team that's not in the room today, but just know that I work very closely with that team. My whole team does. We really feel strongly in the principle of integrated climate adaptation and resilience. We have a whole program for that. And so some of what I'm talking to today is very much informed by that principle. And just for those that don't know, the Office of Planning and Research, we do work directly out of the governor's office, but we work very closely with sister agencies across the very large suite of state departments and agencies in California, which I'll touch on some of that today. So, as many know, and I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but California is extremely at risk to wildfire, as is much of the Western United States and even many other parts of the US. This map I'm showing on the screen just shows you one way to look at the dimension of wildfire and risk that even exists on the ground today throughout California. You'll see areas of very dark brown, red, and orange. These areas are considered very high or extreme risk. So this covers a very large part of the state. And in reality, it's always been this way. California is a fire risk environment. It's a high fire risk environment. In fact, many of our ecosystems actually depend on fire. We have entire species of vegetation that actually thrive and need periodic fire for their sustenance and survival. And our Native communities in California have known this for millennia. Our Native American communities actually learn how to adapt to and manage fire, both by actively setting prescribed burns and other methods of stewarding the landscape. And we've sort of gotten away from that over the last 150 years or so. And we're trying to get back, right? So, but just setting the context here is California fire is part of who we are. We've got some problems to deal with, some of which have to do with our growth, some of what has to do with climate change. And so we'll talk about that as we move forward. Last year in particular was a severe year, one of the most severe on record in terms of the scale of acreage burned. 6 of the largest of California's wildfires in our state's history occurred last year. You'll see one of the largest fires ever recorded in the United States. The August Complex fire burned over 1 million acres. That's the first what we call gigafire. We used to just talk about megafires, which were fires that exceeded 100,000 acres. Now we're in the new era of gigafires, and it's not showing any signs. The signs are showing that we could have more of these in the coming years and decades. So this is what we're very concerned about. Of course, I do want to point out that this graph doesn't show the most damaging fires we've had. One of the reasons we invited tenants in the room today is actually some of our smaller fires have been our more disastrous fires in terms of the scale of human life loss and structural loss. The Tubbs fire, the Nuns fire, and other fires in Sonoma County are right up in the top 2 or 3 largest, not largest, but most destructive fires, as well as what folks may be familiar with, the Camp Fire, which occurred in Butte County, which was our most destructive and devastating fire to date, with the loss of 85% of a town of 25,000 people, the town of Paradise, and the loss of over 85 lives. So We're very concerned about not just the growing scale and size of the fires, we're concerned about the losses that we're seeing in the growing scale of losses. Also, just the time factor. I mean, this pie graph shows that up until 1999, the three largest fires on record are nothing compared to the fires that we've seen since the year 2000. These are the largest fires in California history arrayed by time. And you'll see that most of them have occurred since the year 2000. Many have looked at this graph and said, oh, it's because of climate change. Well, that's partially true, but it also has a lot more to do with where we've built and developed and how we've managed our landscapes over the last 100 years or so. So just know that these large fires have been increasing, not just in size, but also in time, and that many of them are occurring more frequently and more rapidly and on an increasing scale that we haven't seen before. The losses that we're sustaining in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, W-U-I is the acronym as many know it, has actually gradually been increasing over time. And this probably has a little bit more to do with the expansion of the footprint of the WUI in California where we're building. But we know that climate change also plays a factor in terms of the severity of the burns and the extensiveness that we're seeing. And of course, this graph doesn't capture anything that happened after 2018. So in 2019, not so much, but we actually did see some more substantial losses in the WUI last year with those very large fires. So what are we doing about it? I'm going to mostly talk today about the planning approaches, but just know that California, the state of California, and other kind of regional and local efforts, there's so much being done in terms of forest management, in terms of getting more sophisticated on suppressing and preventing fire through our first responders and our fire agencies. There's a lot that's going on that we won't be able to cover today. I'll more focus on the image on the left, which is what my agency is doing to guide local planning and changing our thinking. But just know that there's many multi-pronged approaches that California is currently engaging to take a more holistic statewide approach to adapting and building resilience to the growing problem of wildfire that we have. From a planning perspective in California, we fairly recently introduced new requirements to look at both climate adaptation and wildfire hazard risk within the last 5 to 8 years or so. Up until the year 2015, it was not a requirement to look at climate adaptation in our planning. It now is. The same goes for wildfire hazard and risk reduction. About 6 or 7 years ago, we instituted some very specific and detailed planning requirements for general plans in California. And for those that aren't familiar with California's general plans, they are comprehensive community-wide plans that are adopted by cities and counties. So we have 58 counties and 400 and change cities that must adopt and kind of keep up to date these general plans. And they serve as a very foundational document for our community planning. We also have just an evolving set of safety element requirements. There are constantly bills being passed in the legislature that introduce new requirements like evacuation route adequacy. These two bills that passed in 2019 were a direct outcome and a legislative response to our severe wildfires that occurred in 2017 and 2018 in terms of the adequacy of evacuation procedures in the event of catastrophic hazard events. So just getting to the meat of our guidance and what we would like to see planners do in California and all other stakeholders as well, that really does start around engagement and outreach. And if you look at the way that we're guiding adaptation planning, this falls right in line with this, is really setting the table and getting the right stakeholders in the mix early and often as possible. We have CAL FIRE, our state fire agency, local fire agencies. We have a lot of expertise in California about fire ecology. Getting our tribes at the table, our Native American tribes, and giving them a voice and lifting them up in the process is super important. And in many cases, they're starting to lead really important local and regional efforts around building resilience, which is really exciting. Fire safe councils, firewise communities, community members themselves. There's just a lot of stakeholders and players that really need to be engaged early and often. So everyone's on the same page about not just assessing hazards and risks, but what to do about it and how to plan and adapt under changing conditions. That risk assessment is really important up front. Our guidance does kind of walk planners and users of this guidance through what it looks like to look at the intensity or likelihood of a wildfire, which is what we call hazard, And then who's at risk? And this looks at susceptibility in terms of first and second order effects on our communities and our resources. So, really trying to get folks to think holistically about this. For adaptation planning practitioners, we know this isn't new. This is an integrated way of thinking about not just what the problem is, but who's at risk, and then how climate change can play a factor in that. So we do send a really important message in our newer guidance around integrating this hazard, very specific hazard focused risk with climate vulnerability assessments and adaptation measures. I know a really important topic for this group, also for the state of California, is prioritizing the needs of our most vulnerable populations. I know Tennis can speak to this when he talks about Sonoma County's experience, but we know very painfully, based on the last 5 years of wildfire, that these catastrophic events have disproportionately impacted our vulnerable and disadvantaged communities the most. Not only are they impacted the most during an event, but especially in recovery, where there's no temporary housing, emergency shelter, not places to go. In many cases, it's been demonstrated that the resources for recovery are disproportionately skewed towards people with resources and our white communities. So how do we change this conversation? There's a lot of great things I think Tennis can speak to this, but our guidance also at the state level speaks to really doing a better job at accounting for community vulnerability in our general planning and making sure that the implementation mechanisms really do prioritize those needs. In terms of the kind of technical planning, kind of policy and implementation mechanisms, we really, in our wildfire guidance, think first and foremost about just reducing risk to the communities we have today. And so I'll focus on that first, but then second of all, I'll focus on what do we do about planning for the future in terms of future growth, future housing needs, changes in infrastructure, how to build more resiliently. So on the reducing risk to existing communities side, we sort of think of three big buckets of policy and implementation mechanisms. The first is really just to retrofit and protect what we have. We know that home hardening infrastructure, doing a better job at defensible space, and looking at landscape management, looking outside of developed areas, especially in the WUI adjacent areas, is just a critical need. We know what works in California. We just don't have the resources and mechanisms to really streamline and aggressively ramp up funding for that work. So we're actively having those conversations statewide or even at the federal level, but also really encouraging local communities to deliberately plan for this in your general plans, local hazard mitigation plans, begin to really seed the projects that you would like to see funded so that we can get that retrofitting and protection in place. The really third important piece, though, is that increasing community capacity and resilience, right? And so I spoke to this a little bit about the vulnerable communities piece, but we're really asking local agencies to not just plan to mitigate the hazard or protect resources. We want folks to begin to plan as if this will eventually happen. And so what does it look like to increase community capacity to not just respond, but recover and rebuild differently than we have in the past? So I wish I had a lot more time to give on what that all looks like, but I think Tennis will do a good job of illustrating local examples. On the long range planning side of this equation, we are starting to have conversations, and we have done so in our guidance for planners to think about how we avoid or minimize unreasonable risk to wildfire with climate change in the mix when we're thinking about long range planning and development review. We sort of have a kind of, some folks like to say, competing crises, right? We've got a housing crisis in California. I don't have time to unpack that fully, but we're 1 to 2 million units short of the housing we need to fully house all income levels of our population in the state. And yet we have these growing threat of wildfires and increasing scale of losses, both in our natural landscapes and our wildland urban interface, where we really need to think critically about the best places to put housing and how to help local agencies do that more effectively. We know that a lot of local agencies don't connect their housing planning and their hazard planning and their land use planning together. So some of our newer guidance really asks folks to think about those critical decisions, especially in, let's call it, the land use alternatives analysis process or the site selection inventory process when we're doing our housing planning with our regional housing needs allocations and our housing planning in California, are really starting to connect those dots together. There's also a lot of the second piece of this is also really aggressively more going after local planning and design solutions for when we do actually build housing or other land uses in the WUI. There's a way to build more resiliently. We've seen a lot of success in the codes and standards that have been adopted. We have California has adopted the International WUI Code, right, that hardens new construction. That's been proven to be fairly effective, and it continues to evolve and improve. We also have something called the fire safe regulations in California, which more apply at the subdivision or the project level, which is also an evolving set of regs. And I know Tennis will touch on this. But we know that these regulations are just the floor. And there's a lot of ways to build and design resiliently that aren't necessarily codified yet. And so what we're looking for is best practice. And I know Tennis can also speak to when he gets the mic here. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to stop talking and hand this over to Tennis. I know there's a lot that I could have covered that I didn't, but really excited to be in the room today and looking forward to what Tennis has to say from the local perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm just going to switch us over. One moment. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Justine. And thank you, Eric. As you can hear, for those of you who are the local practitioners, having a partner like Eric in the state governor's office is critical. Obviously, someone who's a licensed planner and has that broader perspective, and yet still understands the challenges for us as local practitioners. So that's the perspective I'm going to give today. As someone who's a city planner by training, but also an accidental evolving expert in emergency operations. So for those who aren't familiar with Sonoma County, just want to give you a brief map point. So we're 30 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge, 1,500 square miles, about a million acres. We are a classic hipster hick county. We have our 1 foot literally in the modernity of the Bay Area and 1 foot in the Redwood Empire. Very traditional culture, still resource-based. About 500,000 people. And then you can see that the tragic numbers that reflect some of the history that Eric gave in his slides of that million acres. Over a quarter of them have burned in the last 5 years, and we've lost 5,600 homes. And unfortunately, with that, 22 lives. It really changes the way you see your practice day to day. Justine, next slide. So I just wanted to focus on my experience and the three realities that have grounded me in this experience since the 2017 complex fires. And that is disaster response. This, for a planning practitioner and a local government employee, is something that you're introduced to during your contract when you sign. There's this little provision that says, oh, by the way, you may be called up as a disaster service worker. And it was really an asterisk in most people's career. Last year, we spent 62% of our time in emergency operations. When I first started, we had no training. And it was through a couple of incidents, flood and an earthquake in 2015, that we realized the need. So we went from literally having one person, me, in the planning and intelligence section to now 40, split among 3 teams who have varying levels of expertise that are assigned in emergency operations. And we have dealt, as you may have read in the media, with 5 fires, major conflagrations, as Eric mentioned, some of the most destructive. And they hit not just property in the wildland urban interface, but areas you wouldn't even think of, areas that were separated from the WUI by a 6-lane freeway and were subdivisions in miles away from the WUI. So our experience as we look at how to plan for climate adaptation is that the risk is really countywide. And it makes us look at wild and urban interface and fire severity maps in a much different light, more comprehensive. Flooding is also increased. Unfortunately, we have 4 rivers in the county: the Wallala, the Russian, the Petaluma, and the Sonoma. The Russian River has the highest rate of flood repetition in the country, which is not a reputation you want. And that's not the river's fault. We just have continued to choke it with development and putting that development in the wrong place. And as climate change descends upon us, that mistake is becoming more acute. And I can get to some of the changes we'll be looking at in response to that in a moment. And then sea level rise. A good deal of our coast, as you saw, of our county is on the coast, and it also has a bay shore. Both are rising now measurably. This is an impact that we thought might be decades off that has arrived. Why is that important to us? Well, economically, Sonoma County accounts for over 10% of United States salmon harvest, wild salmon harvest, and 26% of crab right out of our marina in Bodega Bay. We have a number of historic villages along the coast. On the bayfront, we have some important agricultural land that's subject to sea level rise and the opportunity to convert a good deal of that land to wetlands as a buffer against the negative impacts of rising bay levels. So when it comes to climate action, we've really tried to seek out the advice of our experts. And one of the close relationships that we've developed over the last 5 years is with CALE Fire. Unfortunately, we have strike teams. Well, we're fortunate to have strike teams, 3 that have come to our county in the last 5 years. These are the real pros, the fire chiefs and their specialized units that wonderfully descend upon us with their portable cities and work very collaboratively with locals on coordinating fire strategy, evacuation, and all other means of recovery. And they bring in all sorts of assets from the state and federal governments to assist local governments. We're very fortunate in Sonoma County to have Ben Nichols as our CALE Fire chief. Ben grew up in a CALE Fire family in a forest community called Casadero on the Russian River. And he knows every contour of our county. One of his aphorisms that he mentions to us is that fire is always looking for its next meal. And that's certainly what we've experienced through these last 3 major fire seasons. And by that, he means that just because a fire comes through an area and burns portions of it, that it won't come back and visit again. I don't know if I'm being given the timeout here. Oh, good. Thank you, Justine. But it's really an apt phrase because we've seen in the Mayacamas Mountains to the east of most of our development is that fire has come through not once, but 3 times and looked for those areas that have yet to be burned. So it's very efficient. And how we see ourselves combining our practice as land use practitioners and responders, disaster response responders, is sitting down with someone like Ben and saying, okay, where is it coming next? And really taking a perspective of forming a strategy by listening to fire experts to figure out where it's going to happen, and then really working from the building out and the wildland in. As you saw in Eric's slide of the 3-pronged approach, we have a program, the first of its kind in California now, to look at structural hardening. So making those modifications beyond what the otherwise relatively progressive building code in California requires, to make that structure as resistant to fire as possible. Then secondly, looking at defensive space and in 30, 100, and 300 foot radii around buildings to balance the needs for landscape, but also fire safety and habitat preservation. And then to look from the wildland in. We had this great time over a midnight burrito in the emergency operations bunker to sit down with Ben and ask him where the fire is going next. And our next program will be informed by our conversation with him, where he went through a 100-year history of fire in Sonoma County, and then where he saw it coming next. One area being where it has, again, come back 3 times over in the Mayacamas Mountains, from Sonoma Mountain in Sonoma Valley over the mountain towards Petaluma, and then along the entire coastal part, including the Russian River Valley. So our grant that we have in will look at all measures of disaster avoidance instead of disaster response, because as planning practitioners, we're all exhausted with response. We want to get in front of the challenge. And that means instilling not just selective forestry, but carbon farming, instilling equity factors into staffing for mechanical removal, and sensitive habitat planting. So really trying to take a comprehensive approach to what we can do in the wildland to lessen fire and use fire, of course, in prescribed burns with CALE fire. A complicated process, but we have really good teachers with Indigenous people. We have 5 tribes in Sonoma County with whom we hold excellent relationships. And here we are going back to the beginning and learning what their ancestors knew. So it's a really great collaborative approach. Then as we can attest to some of the presentation at ERIC had, when I got into planning, I hate to say it, but 40 years ago, the safety element in the general plan was really an asterisk. The hazard mitigation plan was this obligation you went through in helping your fire department plan out the next 5 years. Now, and they were also done in isolation. The county did one separate from its, in our case, our 9 cities, which is crazy because disasters don't care about local boundaries. So the difference now is with a state mandate, and I think our experience, all of us realize that health, environmental and public health and safety is the first criterion that we have to address, or the others really don't matter. So those are now being done on a regional or sub-regional basis. In our case, all the cities in the county are getting together to do the hazard mitigation plan, which will be adopted in a very accelerated manner in fall. So that is a great partnership born out of so many of the relationships that developed during fire disaster response. And then the general plan overhaul. We're reaching that zenith of our 20-year term, informal term, and our plan needs to be redone. And the safety element will be key, along with our environmental justice element, because as Eric mentioned, there's a disproportionate impact on disadvantaged communities. And we really did not respond well in 2017 as a community. Sonoma County is approximately 25% Latino, and a good deal of folks who are in the service economy that is severely impacted by fire, and of course, farm labor. We didn't have the communication in place with Spanish translation. We had no communication in place for people for whom Spanish is a second language, English a third, and those are people from very rural parts of southern Mexico that have a tradition of working in the vineyards here. So over the last 5 years and through multiple disasters, we have built those communication mechanisms, and that's now an integral part of communications out of our emergency operations center with local radio stations, having interpreters on our staff, which are really important for our day-to-day work and for emergency operations, and will be really important in the social relationships we build once we get the general plan underway. We've really wanted to start this year, but COVID has borne out not a very, well, this is a great forum for this type of discussion. It really sucks for general plans, especially if you're trying to reach out to a disadvantaged community. If you want to get to the Latinx community in Sonoma County, as I tell my staff, we are all going to church and to school in the evenings because that's where our citizens are. And that's where that's how we need to reach out to them directly. So I'm really looking forward to a post-pandemic effort in that way. Finally, I want to touch on reconciling some of the competing directives that we receive. And again, I know my dear friend Eric was a little concerned when he saw the word conflicting, but I have to say, I think about forums like ASAP and CALE and the kind of professionals that the governor's brought in, like Eric, into the Office of Planning and Research. This is the type of paradigm that we have to use on this Earth Day as a good reminder. You know, we are all operating through a government structure, whether we're private practitioners, nonprofit professionals, or government officials. You know, this 200-year-old male-dominated hierarchy that's almost paramilitary. It doesn't lend itself well to the type of effort that we need in a democracy to get to climate action. We really need a more synergistic way of addressing these issues that I think this organization represents. So it's refreshing to be part of it. We need to bring that to these mandates and find a way to reconcile them. For instance, wild and urban interface. If you remember the map that Eric brought up that showed California in the different colors from yellow through to dark brown, it shows Sonoma County is predominantly orange. I think after these experiences, the map is being revised to show us in almost most of it in a very high or high fire severity area. So the wild and urban interface is to us an area where we should not intensify human occupation. So at a operational level in planning, that means updating your general plan to reduce densities there. It means on a project by project basis, not approving conditional uses that are going to put resorts or wineries or certain types of cannabis operations where you're bringing in more people in harm's way, especially on roads that are predominantly long, narrow, one-lane thoroughfares that just cannot handle that much traffic. So you have that environmental constraint that's very important to observe. Then we have vehicle miles traveled, which is a great tool for controlling suburban sprawl, especially greenfield sprawl. But I think all of us as practitioners are struggling with what that means for projects such as hospitality uses, where when we all go on vacation, the reason we do that is to get away from our homes and away from urban development in many cases. So that's a struggle. And then we have regional housing needs assessment that Eric mentioned. We consider ourselves a pro-housing county. We are the only county in the nation that has urban growth boundaries, voter approved, supported by community separators, voter approved, supported by open space district tax investments, voter approved. So all of those, and we have general plans, all 10 general plans in our subregion talk about city center growth around a transit line, the smart rail system. So even with all those things in place and the fact that in the last 2 housing cycles, we've met our goal, our next assigned allocation is a almost 500% increase in housing units, which we will be challenged to not bust that planning paradigm I just went through in order to meet it, which we're going to have to be working with our state partners to adjust significantly. That housing really belongs in cities, not the unincorporated county. And then finally to environmental justice, which is a great element in our general planning process. And it helps, it is going to be the thing we help use to point to the inequities that can result from kind of blindly applying the physical planning constraints I just mentioned, because oftentimes when you push housing out and away from daily needs, you are creating environmental justice and equity problems, because that tends to put lower income housing developments farther away from public transit, from grocery and other daily needs. So again, we're going to be looking to our friend Eric and his staff in the governor's office as a way of reconciling all these challenges. The great part is we have organizations like this that help us overcome some of the distortions that happen between the local governments, the regional planning entities, and the state mandates. So thanks again for the opportunity to speak to you on Earth Day, and I really look forward to questions from the conference. Thanks. Yeah, and feel free to reach out. There's my cell and office number. Cell is best these days, just because I never know where I'm going to be. Thanks.
Let me try that again, unmuted. Thank you, Eric and Tennis, for your remarks. That was a lot to take in. And I think, you know, one of my first reflections is just the magnitude of the challenge. Not only dealing with the wildfire risk today, but with a changing climate and trying to understand where we're headed. I will pull some questions, I think, from the chat, but I would also invite everyone who's here to turn on their camera, and if they'd like to ask a question, to put up a hand so that we can call on you. And we also have a Jamboard. We will drop the link in the chat again, where you can drop your questions if that's a better way to ask them. So I think one question that occurs to me, maybe to start us off, is at what scale should we be planning? We're talking about the scale of the county, we're talking about state guidance. You know, are we able to really shift the paradigm of wildfire planning when we're talking about a case-by-case basis of not, you know, the land use review process or the zoning boards? Do we operate at the scale of the county? Is the scale of the county large enough to really make a change? I guess that's a question for both of you.
Eric, do you want to start?
I can start. Yeah, I mean, I think we need to do this at all scales. We need to do this nationally. And I know there's been national work done on this through the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and the great tool that we've created with the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And there's federal work on that. Great work at the federal level. Statewide, I had that image of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. If you read through that plan, it's loaded with not just state agency directed work, but really the need to start leveraging and supporting our regional partnerships that are forming. A really good example where tennis, your jurisdiction is a member, is the North Coast Resources Partnership in California, which is really a regional resilience-based framework for looking at integrated fire and watershed and community health, right? Great models. We have a whole state, that partnership in particular was a pilot program of our Department of Conservation through the regional, oh gosh, I can't remember the name. Anyway, a great regional framework that we plan to scale up. I mean, that partnership is one of several partnerships which have proven to be very successful, and we'd like to see that scaled up. So it's not just at the city or county scale. We want to see inroads made where we can. You know, the state's taking really proactive too in California to do statewide work that provides local and regional benefit. We did a massive California vegetation treatment program that's going to provide a very strategic and targeted plan for managing overgrowth of vegetation in certain landscapes. And there was an environmental review attached to that to help to streamline the work. So, you know, that's something where the state has the power to come in and really make inroads in areas where we need to be doing things at scale to manage the health of our forests. So definitely all scales are super important.
Agreed. And one of the things that's been really heartening to see, kind of as a taxpayer and a policymaker, is the grant requirements that we've been able, the requirements of the grants we've been able to secure through the California Office of Emergency Services and through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, where one of the key components is give us a project that's scalable. And that's a great thing about the federal system. If you just come out with a blanket federal approach, it is bound to not work in large parts of our country, which is just so magnificently diverse. But if you can test it in different local markets like Sonoma County, and you have a structural hardening in an area with repeated drought and fire, that's going to be one response. It's going to be a little different in maybe wetter Tennessee. So that's been a requirement, and every single grant for which we've applied and secured, that has been one of the primary components. And I think it's good to see, because I know we keep in mind about how what we do can be scaled to at least other counties in California, because it's diverse here. I mean, you go back to that map I showed in the second tile. What we're fortunate in that we have some space outside the WUI where we can locate urban development. There are counties in California like Mariposa that are entirely in the WUI. Their cities are majority disadvantaged communities. So it's an example of how when you come up with a uniform policy, don't build in the WUI. Well, to someone in Mariposa County, you just lost them. So unless you have the discrete application of these policies, we're not going to be successful. We got to bring people along.
Thanks. We have a question in the chat about restoration efforts and the coordination also at various scales in terms of climate resilience, planning for climate resilience and natural regrowth after wildfire events. I'll add to that, how do you coordinate across jurisdictions? And I guess that's in part, what is the role of the state?
Well, part of it is just that I tell you, I am awed when CAL FIRE comes in. They have so stepped up the game, and I know in speaking to my counterparts in more rural counties that it is absolutely essential to the environmental restoration that needs to happen in disaster recovery. So one element of disaster response as the fire is being controlled, our staff go in with CAL FIRE inspectors, and the two are, they have two goals. One, to look at it from a building code standpoint, can this property be reoccupied? So they're looking at green, yellow, or red tags to be placed. And then they're going through the classifications under the federal response program of everything from minor to destroyed. That's being done with handheld devices. And then while they're going through and looking at the built environment, they're also have another whole team of archaeologists, foresters, landscape architects, who and ecologists who are identifying areas of probable debris slide and evaluating how much vegetation's been lost. That's all happening while people are watching the news and seeing the conflagration in progress. So by the time that fire is 100% controlled, we have already got a strategy as to how we're going to go in and place environmental controls like wattles and other mitigation devices in environmentally sensitive places. We have indigenous people who are informing us where cultural resources are so that we can minimize the impacts during the firefight and certainly during the restoration process. It is an impressive use of public resources.
Eric, is there anything you wanted to add from the state perspective on coordination of restoration efforts?
I can't say I have anything super specific to add to that question. That's if I was in the room with our natural resources agencies, or they'd probably be answer that question better than I have. I know that they are involved in that work. I just can't speak to the specifics.
Yeah.
It changes the way we compose our agency too. 7 years ago when I first came, we didn't have a natural resources team. Now we have our own hydrologist, forester, biologists, on our geomorphology, all on our staff, because these issues recur, not just in disaster response, but just in evaluating projects. How can you respond to climate action if you only have people that are special, whose specialty is in the built environment? You need to have a breadth of professionals.
I'd like to ask maybe a two-part question. One, which is about, just over the last 4 years, I'm thinking really since 2017, in what ways have you seen the approach that CAL FIRE takes to fighting fires and to that guidance shift with recognition of traditional ecological knowledge? And then a sort of second part of that, in what ways do you think in the future conservation efforts perhaps could be aligned with fire restoration and fire adaptive planning?
Sure. I can give a good example. Well, one, I would say when I first started, you had kind of the, again, the paramilitary fire response. There really wasn't that sweeping environmental component that was either part of the planning for fire response or the immediate response that comes after fire control. So now that's just an integrated part of the work that's done. And so the last two fires that happened, so it's 2017 was a real changing point in our partnership with CAL FIRE, where the incident commander said, look, I don't have capacity anymore. That was the first time I ever heard someone from CAL FIRE say that. And he sent his section chief down to visit with us at the local level and share where they needed assistance. And it started a partnership with each one of the incidents that happened afterward, that we're now just a fully integrated team. And it gives us a chance with our natural resource specialists to identify the areas of sensitivity that are well known to us and may not be known to state natural resource specialists. So there's literally both teams, both groups going as one team in the field. Then how does that translate to what I talked about earlier about the, working for climate action planning from the wildland in? We're using our fire breaks that have been developed during the last 3 fires and using those and maintaining them as environmental buffers. So instead of letting them go back from, it was unfortunately formerly a redwood forest as a break that has been felled, and where broom would probably flourish if not maintained, we're now maintaining those as a break, as a natural buffer between the burned area and the built environment.
I just dropped a link in the chat to this, but from a state perspective, really exciting news that last week Governor Newsom did sign a $536 million early action part of our budget. This is an advance funding stream that goes well in advance of the full state budget, which if approved will kick in July 1st. So this is getting some early work going on some fire prevention, resilience building work in our highest risk communities and landscapes in California. So I could spend the next hour trying to unpack all that for you folks, but I'm going to leave that for you to read because there's some really good stuff that really aligned with some of the principles that we've talked today about some of the both local, regional, and state work that we have going on. Even though this is a big statewide pot of money, it ends up in local projects. So it does take a while for that money to move through, which is why the early action budget was so critical here. We want to start to get projects funded and going before the worst part of our fire season starts later in the summer. So just wanted, folks, feel free to read that. And if any questions, feel free to reach out to me after the session today.
I will.
Thanks, Eric. Maybe a last question, and then we'll wrap it up in about 3-4 minutes. In relation to that package, I'm curious, how are you planning for disadvantaged communities and frontline communities, and how does that figure into the funding? And more generally, Tennis mentioned the example of the communication challenges with a limited tool set that you've adapted over the past few years, but I'm wondering what goes beyond that.
The two responses to that. One, that there is within this $536 million early action budget for this year, there is a priority to focus some of the priority projects on our most vulnerable communities, including communities that are considered disadvantaged in California. This actually mirrors actions that were taken 2 years ago when Governor Newsom took office. It was just in the wake of the Camp Fire, right? He took office in 2019. And within 90 days, he issued a strike force report that actually they created a framework where they evaluated where to, they parked about 90 different projects in areas where they saw the highest degree of vulnerability and the biggest degree of financial need based on vulnerability and highest degree of risk. So mirroring that, this $536 million this year, 2 years later, will do the same thing. It's designed to prioritize investments where we see the highest risk and the highest vulnerability.
Tennis, anything you want to add before we wrap up?
No, just that there's maybe another question. But...
Yeah, I think we have to share just a few more housekeeping announcements about CALE, but thank you both. That terrific conversation.